7:53 p.m., 8/27/2024. Beyond the Horizon by Eugene O'Neill, Act 3, Scene 1. Same as Act 2, Scene 1, the sitting room of the farmhouse about 6 o'clock in the morning of a day toward the end of October 5 years later. It is not yet dawn, but as the action progresses, the darkness outside the windows gradually fades to gray. The room, seen by the light of the shadeless oil lamp with a smoky chimney which stands on the table, presents an appearance of decay, of dissolution. The curtains at the windows are torn and dirty, and one of them missing. The closed desk is gray, with accumulated dust as if it had not been used in years. Blotches of dampness disfigure the wallpaper. Threadbare trails leading to the kitchen and outer doors show in the faded carpet. The top of the coverless table is stained with the imprints of hot dishes and spilt food. The rung of one rocker has been clumsily mended with a piece of plain board. A brown coating of rust covers the unblacked stove. A pile of wood is stacked up carelessly against the wall by the stove. The whole atmosphere of the room, contrasted with that of former years, is one of an habitual poverty, too hopelessly resigned to be any longer ashamed or even conscious of itself. At the rise of the curtain, Ruth is discovered sitting by the stove, with hands outstretched to the warmth as if the air in the room were damp and cold. A heavy shawl is wrapped about her shoulders, half concealing her dress of deep mourning. She has aged horribly. Her pale, deeply lined face has the stony lack of expression of one to whom nothing more can ever happen, whose capacity for emotion has been exhausted. When she speaks, her voice is without timbre, low and monotonous. The negligent disorder of her dress, the slovenly arrangement of her hair, now streaked with gray, her muddied shoes run down at the heel, give full evidence of the apathy in which she lives. Her mother is asleep in her wheelchair beside the stove toward the rear, wrapped up in a blanket. There is a sound from the open bedroom door in the rear, as if someone were getting out of bed. Ruth turns in that direction with a look of dull annoyance. A moment later, Robert appears in the doorway, leaning weakly against it for support. His hair is long and unkempt, his face and body emaciated. There are bright patches of crimson over his cheekbones, and his eyes are burning with fever. He is dressed in corduroy pants, a flannel shirt, and wears worn carpet slippers on his bare feet. Ruth, dully. Shh! Ma's asleep. Robert, speaking with an effort. I won't wake her. He walks weakly to a rocker by the side of the table and sinks down in it, exhausted. Ruth, staring at the stove. You better come near the fire where it's warm. Robert, no, I'm burning up now. I'm burning up now. Ruth, that's the fever. You know the doctor told you not to get up and move around. Robert, irritably. That old fossil. He doesn't know anything. Go to bed and stay there. That's his only prescription. Ruth, indifferently. How you feeling now? Robert, buoyantly. Better. Much better than I've felt in ages. Really, I'm fine now. Only very weak. It's the turning point, I guess. From now on, I'll pick up so quick I'll surprise you, and no thanks to that old fool of country quack either. Ruth. He's always tended to us. Robert. Always helped us to die, you mean? He tended to Pa and Ma, and... His voice breaks. And to Mary. Ruth, dully. He did the best he knew, I suppose. After a pause. Well, Andy's bringing a specialist with him when he comes. That ought to suit you. Robert, bitterly. Is that why you're waiting up all night? Ruth. Yes. Robert. For Andy? Ruth. Without a trace of feeling. Somebody had got to. It's only right for someone to meet him after he's been gone for 5 years. Robert. With bitter mockery. 5 years. It's a long time. Ruth. Yes. Robert. Meaningly. To wait. Ruth. Indifferently. It's past now. Robert. Yes, it's past. After a long pause. Have you got his 2 telegrams with you? Ruth nods. Let me see them, will you? My head was so full of fever when they came I couldn't make head or tail to them. Hastily. But I'm feeling fine now. Let me read them again. Ruth takes them from the bosom of her dress and hands them to him. Ruth. Here. The first one's on top. Robert, opening it. New York. Just landed from steamer. Have important business to wind up here. We'll be home as soon as deal is completed. He smiles bitterly. Business first was always Andy's motto. He reads. Hope you are well. I hope you are all well, Andy. He repeats ironically. Hope you are all well. Ruth, dully. He couldn't know you'd been took sick till I answered that and told him. Robert, contritely. Of course he couldn't. I'm a fool. I'm touchy about nothing lately. Just what did you say in your reply? Ruth, inconsequentially. I had to send it collect. Robert, irritably. What did you say was the matter with me? Ruth. I wrote you had lung trouble. Robert, flying into a petty temper. You are a fool. How often have I explained to you that it's pleurisy is the matter with me? You can't seem to get it in your head that the pleura is outside the lungs, not in them. Ruth, callously. I only wrote what Dr. Smith told me. Robert, angrily. He's a damned ignoramus. Ruth, dully. Makes no difference. I had to tell Andy something, didn't I? Robert, after a long pause, opening the other telegram. He sent this last evening. Let's see. He reads. Leave for home on midnight train. Just received your wire. Am bringing specialist to see Rob. Will motor to farm from port. He calculates. What time is it now? Ruth. Round 6. Must be. Robert. He ought to be here soon. I'm glad he's bringing a doctor who knows something. The specialist will tell you in a second that there's nothing the matter with my lungs. Ruth, stolidly. You've been coughing an awful lot lately. Robert, irritably. What nonsense. For God's sakes, haven't you ever had a bad cold yourself? Ruth stares at the stove in silence. Robert fidgets in his chair. There is a pause. Finally, Robert's eyes are fixed on the sleeping Mrs. Atkins. Your mother is lucky to be able to sleep so soundly. Ruth. Ma's tired. She's been sitting up with me most of the night. Robert, mockingly. Is she waiting for Andy too? There is a pause. Robert sighs. I couldn't get to sleep to save my soul. I counted 10 million sheep if I counted one. No use. I gave up trying finally and just laid there in the dark thinking. He pauses, then continues in a tone of tender sympathy. I was thinking about you, Ruth, of how hard these last years must have been for you. Appealingly. I'm sorry, Ruth. Ruth, in a dead voice. I don't know. They're past now. They were hard on all of us. Robert. Yes. On all of us but Andy. With a flash of sick jealousy. Andy's made a big success of himself, the kind he wanted, mockingly. And now he's coming home to let us admire his greatness. Frowning irritably. What am I talking about? My brain must be sick too. After a pause. Yes, these years have been terrible for both of us. His voice is lowered to a trembling whisper. Especially the last 8 months since Mary died. He forces back a sob with a convulsive shudder, then breaks out in a passionate agony. Our last hope of happiness. I could curse God from the bottom of my soul if there was a God. He is racked by a violent fit of coughing and hurriedly puts his handkerchief to his lips. Ruth, without looking at him. Mary's better off being dead. Robert gloomily. We'd all be better off for that matter. With a sudden exasperation. You tell your mother of yours she's got to stop saying that Mary's death was due to a weak constitution inherited from me. On the verge of tears of weakness. It's got to stop, I tell you. Ruth, sharply. Shh! You'll wake her, and then she'll nag at me, not you. Robert coughs and lies back in his chair weakly. A pause. It's all because your mother's down on me for not begging Andy for help. Ruth, resentfully. You might have. He's got plenty. Robert. How can you, of all people, think of taking money from him? Ruth, dully. I don't see the harm. He's your own brother. Robert, shrugging his shoulders. What's the use of talking to you? Well, I couldn't. Proudly. And I've made things going, thank God. You can't deny that without help I've succeeded in. He breaks off with a bitter laugh. My God, what am I boasting of? Debts to this one and that, taxes, interest unpaid. I'm a fool. He lies back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, then speaks in a low voice. I'll be frank, Ruth. I've been an utter failure, and I've dragged you with me. I couldn't blame you in all justice for hating me. Ruth, without feeling. I don't hate you. It's been my fault too, I suppose. Robert. No. You couldn't help loving Andy. Ruth, dully. I don't love anyone. Robert, waving her remark aside. You needn't deny it. It doesn't matter. After a pause with a tender smile. Do you know, Ruth, what I've been dreaming back there in the dark? With a short laugh. I've been planning our future when I get well. He looks at her with appealing eyes as if afraid she will sneer at him. Her expression does not change. She stares at the stove. His voice takes on a note of eagerness. After all, why shouldn't we have a future? We're young yet. If we can only shake off the curse of this farm. It's the farm that's ruined our lives, damn it. And now that Andy's coming back, I'm going to sink in my foolish pride, Ruth. I'll borrow the money from him to give us a good start in the city. We'll go where people live instead of stagnating and start all over again. Confidently. I won't be the failure there that I've been here, Ruth. You won't need to be ashamed of me there. I'll prove to you the reading I've done and can be put to some use. Vaguely. All right. Or something of that sort. I've always wanted to write. Pleadingly. You'll want to do that, won't you, Ruth? Ruth. Dully. There's Ma. Robert. She can come with us. Ruth. She wouldn't. Robert. Angrily. So that's your answer. He trembles with violent passion. His voice is so strange that Ruth turns to look at him in alarm. You're lying, Ruth. Your mother's just an excuse. You want to stay here. You think that because Andy's coming back that... He chokes and has an attack of coughing. Ruth, getting up in a frightened tone. What's the matter? She goes to him. I'll go with you, Rob. Stop that coughing, for goodness sake. It's awful bad for you. She soothes him in dull tones. I'll go with you to the city. Soon you're well again. Honest, I will, Rob, I promise. Rob lies back and closes his eyes. She stands looking down at him anxiously. Do you feel better now? Robert. Yes. Ruth goes back to her chair. After a pause, he opens his eyes and sits up in his chair. His face is flushed and happy. Then you will go, Ruth? Ruth. Yes. Robert, excitedly. We'll make a new start, Ruth. Just you and I. Life owes us some happiness after what we've been through. Vehemently. It must. Otherwise our suffering would be meaningless, and that is unthinkable. Ruth, worried by his excitement. Yes, of course, Rob, but you mustn't. Robert. Oh, don't be afraid. I feel completely well. Really, I do. Now that I can hope again. Oh, if you knew how glorious it feels to have something to look forward to. Can't you feel the thrill of it too? The vision of a new life opening up after all the horrible years? Ruth. Yes, but do be. Robert. Nonsense. I won't be careful. I'm getting back all my strength. He gets lightly to his feet. See? I feel as light as a feather. He walks to her chair and bends down to kiss her, smilingly. One kiss. The first in years, isn't it? To greet the dawn of our new life together. Ruth, submitting to his kiss, worriedly. Sit down, Rob, for goodness sake. Robert, with tender obstinacy, stroking her hair. I won't sit down. You're silly to worry. He rests one hand on the back of her chair. Listen. All our suffering has been a test through which we had to pass to prove ourselves worthy of a finer realization. Exultingly. And we did pass through it. It hasn't broken us. Now the dream is to come true, don't you see? Ruth, looking at him with frightened eyes as if she thought he had gone mad. Yes, Rob, I see. But won't you go back to bed now and rest? Robert, no. I'm going to see the sunrise. It's an augury of good fortune. He goes quickly to the window in the rear left, and pushing the curtains aside, stands looking out. Ruth springs to her feet and comes quickly to the table, left, where she remains watching Robert in a tense, expectant attitude. As he peers out, his body seems gradually to sag, to grow limp and tired. His voice is mournful as he speaks. No sun yet. It isn't time. All I can see is the black rim of the damned hills outlined against a creeping grayness. He turns around, letting the curtains fall back, stretching a hand out to the wall to support himself. His false strength of a moment has evaporated, leaving his face drawn and hollow-eyed. He makes a pitiful attempt to smile. That's not a very happy augury, is it? But the sun will come, soon. He sways weakly. Ruth, hurrying to his side and supporting him. Please go to bed, won't you, Rob? You don't want to be all wore out when the specialist comes, do you? Robert, quickly. No. That's right. You mustn't think I'm sicker than I am. And I feel as if I could sleep now, cheerfully. A good, sound, restful sleep. Ruth, helping him to the bedroom door. That's what you need most. They go inside. A moment later, she reappears, calling back. I'll shut this door so you'll be quiet. She closes the door and goes quickly to her mother and shakes her by the shoulder. Ma, wake up. Mrs. Atkins, coming out of her sleep with a start. Glory be, what's the matter with you? Ruth. It was Rob. He's just been talking to me out there. I put him back to bed. Now that she is sure her mother is awake, her fear passes, and she relapses into dull indifference. She sits down in her chair and stares at the stove dully. He acted funny, and his eyes looked so wild-like. Mrs. Atkins with asperity. And is that all you woke me up out of a sound asleep for and scared me near out of my wits? Ruth. I was afraid. So crazy. I couldn't quiet him. I didn't want to be alone with him that way. Lord knows what he might do. Mrs. Atkins, scornfully. A help I'd be to you, and me not able to move a step. Why didn't you run and get Jake? Ruth, dully. Jake isn't here. He quit last night. He hasn't been paid in 3 months. Mrs. Atkins, indignantly. I can't blame him. What decent person want to work in a place like this? With sudden exasperation. Oh, I wish you'd never married that man. Ruth, warily. You oughtn't to talk about him now when he's sick in bed. Now when he's sick in his bed. Mrs. Atkins, working herself into a fit of rage. You know very well, Ruth Mayo, if it wasn't for me helping you on the sly out of my savings, you'd both been in the poorhouse. And all account of his pig-headed pride and not letting Andy know the state things were in. A nice thing for me to have to support him out of what I'd saved for my last days. And me an invalid with no one to look to. Ruth. Andy'll pay you back, Ma. I can tell him so's Rob will never know. Mrs. Atkins, with a snort. What did Rob think you and him was living on, I'd like to know? Ruth, dully. He didn't think about it, I suppose. After a slight pause. He said he'd made up his mind to ask Andy for help when he comes. As a clock in the kitchen strikes 6. 6 o'clock. Andy ought to get here directly. Mrs. Atkins, do you think this special doctor will do Rob any good? Ruth, hopelessly. I don't know. Two women remained silent for a time, staring dejectedly at the stove. Mrs. Atkins, shivering irritably. For goodness sake, put some wood on that fire. I'm most freezing. Ruth, pointing to the door in the rear. Don't talk so loud. Let him sleep if he can. She gets warily from the chair and puts a few pieces of wood in the stove. This is the last of the wood. I don't know who will cut more now that Jake's left. She sighs and walks to the window in the rear, left, pulls the curtain aside and looks out. It's getting gray out. She comes back to the stove. Looks like it'd be a nice day. She stretches out her hands to warm them. Must have been a heavy frost last night. We're paying for the spell of warm weather we've been having. A throbbing whine of a motor sounds from the distance outside. Mrs. Atkins, sharply. Shh. Listen. Ain't that an auto I hear? Ruth, without interest. Yes, it's Andy, I suppose. Mrs. Atkins, with nervous irritation. Don't sit there like a silly goose. Look at the state of this room. What'll this strange doctor think of us? Look at the lamp chimney, all smoke. Gracious sakes, Ruth. Ruth, indifferently. I've got a lamp all cleaned up in the kitchen. Mrs. Atkins, peremptorily. Wheel me in there this minute. I don't want him to see me looking a sight. I'll lay down in the room the other side. You don't need me now, and I'm dead for sleep. Ruth wheels her mother off right. The noise of the motor grows louder and finally ceases as the car stops on the road before the farmhouse. Ruth returns from the kitchen with a lighted lamp in her hand, which she sets on the table beside the other. A sound of footsteps on the path is heard, then a sharp rap on the door. Ruth goes and opens it. Andrew enters, followed by Dr. Fawcett, carrying a small black bag. Andrew has changed greatly. His face seems to have grown high-strung, hardened by the look of decisiveness which comes from being constantly under a strain, where judgments on the spur of the moment are compelled to be accurate. His eyes are keener and more alert. There is even a suggestion of ruthless cunning about them. At present, however, his expression is one of tense anxiety. Dr. Fawcett is a short, dark, middle-aged man with a Van Dyke beard. He wears glasses. Ruth. Hello, Andy. I've been waiting. Andrew, kissing her hastily. I got here as soon as I could. He throws off his cap and heavy overcoat on the table, introducing Ruth and the doctor as he does so. He is dressed in an expensive business suit and appears stouter. My sister-in-law, Mrs. Mayo, Dr. Fawcett. They bow to each other insistently. Andrew casts a quick glance about the room. Where's Rob? Ruth, pointing. In there. Andrew. I'll take your coat and hat, doctor. As he helps the doctor with his things. Is he very bad, Ruth? Ruth, dully. He's been getting weaker. Andrew. Damn. This way, doctor. Bring the lamp, Ruth. He goes into the bedroom, followed by the doctor and Ruth carrying the clean lamp. Ruth reappears almost immediately, closing the door behind her, and goes slowly to the outside door, which she opens, and stands in the doorway looking out. The sound of Andrew's and Robert's voices come from the bedroom. A moment later, Andrew re-enters, closing the door softly. He comes forward and sinks down in the rocker on the right at the table, leaning his head on his hand. His face is drawn in a shocked expression of great grief. He sighs heavily, staring mournfully in front of him. Ruth turns and stands watching him. Then she shuts the door and returns to her chair by the stove, turning it so she can face him. Andrew, glancing up quickly in a harsh voice. How long has this been going on? Ruth. You mean, how long has he been sick? Andrew, shortly. Of course. What else? Ruth. It was last summer he had a bad spell first, but he's been ailing ever since Mary died. 8 months ago. Andrew, harshly. Why didn't you let me know? Cable me. Do you want him to die, all of you? I'm damned if it doesn't look that way. His voice breaking. Poor old chap. To be sick in this out-of-the-way hole without anyone to attend to him but a country quack. It's a damned shame. Ruth, dully. I wanted to send you word once, but he only got mad when I told him. He was too proud to ask anything, he said. Andrew. Proud? To ask me? He jumps to his feet and paces nervously back and forth. I can't understand the way you've acted. Didn't you see how sick he was getting? Couldn't you realize why I nearly dropped in my tracks when I saw him? He shudders. Terrible. With fierce scorn. I suppose you're so used to the idea of his being delicate that you took his sickness as a matter of course. God, if I'd only known. Ruth, without emotion. A letter takes so long to get to where you were, and we couldn't afford to telegraph. We owed everyone already, and I couldn't ask Ma. She's been giving me money out of her savings till she hadn't much left. Don't say anything to Rob about it. I never told him. He'd only be mad at me if he knew. But I had to, because God knows how we'd have got on if I hadn't. Andrew, you mean to say... His eyes seemed to take in the poverty-stricken appearance of the room for the first time. You sent that telegram to me, collect? Was it because... Ruth nods silently. And on the table with his fist. Good God, all this time I've had everything. He sits down in his chair and pulls it closely to Ruth's, impulsively. But I can't get it through my head. Why? Why? What has happened? How did it ever come about? Tell me. Ruth, dully. There's nothing much to tell. Things kept getting worse, that's all, and Rob didn't seem to care. He never took any interest since way back when your ma died. After that, he got men to take charge, and they nearly all cheated him. He couldn't tell, and left one after another. Then after Mary died, he didn't pay no heed to anything anymore. He just stayed indoors and took to reading books again. So I had to ask Ma if she wouldn't help us some. Andrew, surprised and horrified. Why, damn it, this is frightful. Rob must be mad not to have let me know. Too proud to ask help of me. What's the matter with him in God's name? A sudden, horrible suspicion entering his mind. Ruth, tell me the truth. His mind hasn't gone back on him, has it? Ruth, dully. I don't know. Mary's dying broke him up terrible, but he's used to her being gone by this, I suppose. Andrew, looking at her queerly. Do you mean to say you're used to it? Ruth, in a dead tone. There's a time comes when you don't mind anymore. Anything. Andrew looks at her fixedly for a moment with great pity. I'm sorry, Ruth. If I seemed to blame you, I didn't realize. The sight of Rob lying in bed there, so gone to pieces, it made me furious at everyone. Forgive me, Ruth. Ruth, there's nothing to forgive. It doesn't matter. Andrew, springing to his feet again and pacing up and down. Thank God I came back before it was too late. This doctor will know exactly what to do. That's the first thing to think of. When Rob's on his feet again, we can get the farm working on a sound basis once more. I'll see to that before I leave. Ruth, you're going away again? Andrew, I've got to. Ruth, you wrote Rob you was coming back to stay this time. Andrew, I expected to until I got to New York. Then I learned certain facts that make it necessary. With a short laugh. To be candid, Ruth, I'm not the rich man you've probably been led to believe by my letters. Not now. I was when I wrote them. I made money hand over fist as long as I stuck to legitimate trading. But I wasn't content with that. I wanted it to come easier. So like all the rest of the idiots, I tried speculation. Oh, I won all right. Several times I've been almost a millionaire on paper. And then come down to earth again with a bump. Finally, the strain was too much. I got disgusted with myself and made up my mind to get out and come home and forget it and really live again. He gives a harsh laugh. And now comes the funny part. The day before the steamer sailed, I saw what I thought was a chance to become a millionaire again. He snaps his fingers. That easy. I plunged. Then before things broke, I left. I was so confident I couldn't be wrong. But when I landed in New York, I wired you I had business to wind up, didn't I? Well, it was the business that wound me up. He smiles grimly, pacing up and down, his hands in his pockets. Ruth, dully. You found you'd lost everything? Andrew, sitting down again. Practically. He takes a cigar from his pocket, bites the end off, and lights it. Oh, I don't mean I'm dead broke. I've saved 10,000 from the wreckage, maybe 20. But that's a poor showing for 5 years' hard work. That's why I'll have to go back. Confidently. I can make it up in a year or so down there, and I don't need but a shoestring to start with. A weary expression comes over his face, and he sighs heavily. I wish I didn't have to. I'm sick of it all. Ruth, it's too bad. Things seem to go wrong, so. Andrew, shaking off his depression briskly. They might be much worse. There's enough left to fix the farm okay before I go. I won't leave till Rob's on his feet again. In the meantime, I'll make things fly around here. With satisfaction. I need a rest, and the kind of rest I need is hard work in the open, just like I used to do in the old days. Stopping abruptly and lowering his voice cautiously. Not a word to Rob about my losing money. Remember that, Ruth. You can see why. If he's grown so touchy, he'd never accept a cent if he thought I was hard up, see? Ruth. Yes, Sandy. After a pause during which Andrew puffs at his cigar abstractedly, his mind evidently busy with plans for the future. The bedroom door is opened, and Dr. Fawcett enters, carrying a bag. He closes the door quietly behind him and comes forward, a grave expression on his face. Andrew springs out of his chair. Andrew. Ah, doctor. He pushes a chair between his own and Ruth's. Won't you have a chair? Fawcett, glancing at his watch. I must catch the 9 o'clock back to the city. It's imperative. I have only a moment. Sitting down and clearing his throat in a perfunctory, impersonal voice. The case of your brother, Mr. Mayo, is... He stops and glances at Ruth and says meaningly to Andrew, perhaps it would be better if you and I... Ruth, with dogged resentment. I know what you mean, doctor. Dully. Don't be afraid. I can't stand it. Don't be afraid I can't stand it. I'm used to bearing trouble by this, and I can guess what you found out. She hesitates for a moment, then continues in a monotonous voice. Rob's gonna die. Andrew, angrily. Ruth! Fawcett, raising his hand as if to command silence. I'm afraid my diagnosis of your brother's condition forces me to the same conclusion as Mrs. Mayo's. Andrew, groaning. But Dr. Shirley, Fawcett, calmly. Your brother hasn't long to live. Perhaps a few days. Perhaps only a few hours. It's a marvel that he's alive at this moment. My examination revealed that both of his lungs are terribly affected. Andrew, brokenly. Good God. Ruth keeps her eyes fixed on her lap in a trance-like stare. Fawcett. I'm sorry I have to tell you this. If there was anything that could be done... Andrew. There isn't anything? Fawcett, shaking his head. It's too late. 6 months ago there might have... Andrew, in anguish. But if we were to take him to the mountains or to Arizona or... Fawcett. That might have prolonged his life 6 months ago. Andrew groans. But now, he shrugs his shoulders significantly. Andrew, appalled by a sudden thought. Good heavens. You haven't told him this, have you, Doctor? Fawcett. No, I lied to him. I said a change of climate. He looks at his watch again nervously. I must leave you. He gets up. Andrew, getting to his feet insistently. But there must still be some chance. Fawcett, as if he were reassuring a child. There is always that last chance. The miracle. He put his hat and coat, bowing to Ruth. Goodbye, Mrs. Mayo. Ruth, without raising her eyes, dully. Goodbye. Andrew, mechanically. I'll walk to the car with you, Doctor. They go out of the door. Ruth sits motionlessly. The motor is heard starting, and the noise gradually recedes into the distance. Andrew re-enters and sits down in his chair, holding his head in his hands. Ruth. She lifts her eyes to his. Hadn't we better go in and see him? God, I'm afraid to. I know he'll read it in my face. The bedroom door is noiselessly opened, and Robert appears in the doorway. His cheeks are flushed with fever, and his eyes appear unusually large and brilliant. Andrew continues with a groan. It can't be, Ruth. It can't be as hopeless as he said. There's always a fighting chance. We'll take Rob to Arizona. He's got to get well. There must be a chance. Robert, in a gentle tone. Why must there, Andy? Ruth turns and stares at him with terrified eyes. Andrew, whirling around. Rob, scoldingly. What are you doing out of bed? He gets up and goes to him. Get right back now and obey the doc, or you're gonna get a licking from me. Robert, ignoring these remarks. Help me over to the chair, please, Andy. Andrew, like hell I will. You're going right back to bed, and that's where you're going, and stay there. He takes hold of Robert's arm. Robert, mockingly. Stay there till I die, eh, Andy? Coldly. Don't behave like a child. I'm sick of lying down. I'll be more rested sitting up. As Andrew hesitates violently, I swear I'll get out of bed every time you put me there. You'll have to sit on my chest, and that wouldn't help my health, and Henny. Come on, Andy. Don't play the fool. I want to talk to you, and I'm going to. With a grim smile. A dying man has some rights, hasn't he? Andrew, with a shudder. Don't talk that way, for God's sake. I'll only let you sit down if you'll promise that. Remember. He helps Robert to the chair between his own and Ruth's. Easy now. There you are. Wait, and I'll get a pillow for you. He goes into the bedroom. Robert looks at Ruth, who shrinks away from him in terror. Robert smiles bitterly. Andrew comes back with the pillow, which he places behind Robert's back. How's that? Robert, with an affectionate smile. Fine, thank you. As Andrew sits down. Listen, Andy. You've asked me not to talk, and I won't after I've made my position clear. Slowly. In the first place, I know I'm dying. Ruth bows her head and covers her face with her hands. She remains like this all during the scene between the two brothers. Andrew. Rob, that isn't so. Robert, wearily. It is so. Don't lie to me. After Ruth put me to bed before you came, I saw it clearly for the first time. Bitterly. I'd been making plans for our future, Ruth's and mine, so it came hard at first, the realization. And when the doctor examined me, I knew. Although he tried to lie about it. And then to make sure I listened at the door to what he told you. So don't mock me with fairy tales about Arizona or any such rot as that. Because I'm dying is no reason you should treat me as an imbecile or a coward. Now that I'm sure what's happening, I can say kismet to it with all my heart. It was only the silly uncertainty that hurt. There is a pause. Andrew looks around in impotent anguish, not knowing what to say. Robert regards him with an affectionate smile. Andrew finally blurts out, It isn't foolish. You have got a chance. If you heard all the doctor said, that ought to prove it to you. Robert. Oh, you mean when he spoke of the miracle? Dryly. I don't believe in miracles, in my case. Besides, I know more than any doctor on earth could know, because I feel what's coming. Dismissing the subject. But we've agreed not to talk about it. Tell me about yourself, Andy. That's what I'm interested in. Your letters were too brief and far apart to be illuminating. Andrew. I meant to write oftener. Robert, with a faint trace of irony. I judge from them you've accomplished all you set out to do 5 years ago. Andrew. That isn't much to boast of. Robert, surprised. Have you really honestly reached that conclusion? Andrew. Well, it doesn't seem to amount to much now. Robert. But you're rich, aren't you? Andrew, with a quick glance at Ruth. Yes, I suppose so. Robert. I'm glad. You can do to the farm all I've undone. And what did you do down there? Tell me. You went in the grain business with that friend of yours? Andrew. Yes. After 2 years, I had a share in it. I sold out last year. He is answering Robert's questions with great reluctance. Robert. And then? Andrew. I went in on my own. Robert. Still in grain? Andrew. Yes. Robert. What's the matter? You look as if I were accusing you of something. Andrew. I'm proud enough of the first 4 years. It's after that I'm not boasting of. I took to speculating. Robert. In wheat? Andrew. Yes. Robert. And you made money gambling? Andrew. Yes. Robert, thoughtfully. I've been wondering what the great change was in you. After a pause. You, a farmer, to gamble in a wheat pit with scraps of paper. There is a spiritual significance in that picture, Andy. He smiles bitterly. I'm a failure, and Ruth's another, but we can both justly lay some of the blame for our stumbling on God. But you're the deepest dyed failure of the three, Andy. You've spent 8 years running away from yourself. Do you see what I mean? You used to be a creator when you loved the farm. You and life were in harmonious partnership. And now, he stops as if seeking vainly for words. My brain is muddled. But part of what I mean is that you're gambling with the thing you used to love to create proves how far astray. So you'll be punished. You'll have to suffer to win back. His voice grows weaker and he sighs wearily. It's no use. I can't say it. He lies back and closes his eyes, breathing pantingly. Andrew, slowly. I think I know what you're driving at, Rob. And it's true, I guess. Robert smiles gratefully and stretches out his hand, which Andrew takes in his. Robert, I want you to promise me to do one thing, Andy. After Andrew, I'll promise anything as God is my judge. Robert, remember, Andy, Ruth has suffered double her share. His voice faltering with weakness. Only through contact with suffering, Andy, will you awaken. Listen. You must marry Ruth afterwards. Ruth, with a cry. Robert lies back, his eyes closed, gasping heavily for breath. Andrew, making signs to her to humor him gently. You're tired out, Rob. You better lie down and rest a while, don't you think? We can talk later on. Robert, with a mocking smile. Later on. You always were an optimist, Andy. He sighs with exhaustion. Yes, I'll go and rest a while. As Andrew comes to help him, it must be near sunrise, isn't it? Andrew. It's after 6. Robert. As Andrew helps him into the bedroom. Shut the door, Andy. I want to be alone. Andrew reappears and shuts the door softly. He comes and sits down on his chair again, supporting his head on his hands. His face is drawn with the intensity of his dry-eyed anguish. Ruth, glancing at him fearfully. He's out of his mind now, isn't he? Andrew, you may be a little delirious. The fever would do that. With impotent rage. God, what a shame. And there's nothing we can do but sit and wait. He springs from his chair and walks to the stove. Ruth, dully. He was talking wild, like he used to. Only this time it sounded unnatural, don't you think? Andrew. I don't know. The things he said to me had truth in them, even if he did talk them way up in the air, like he always sees things. Still, he glances down at Ruth keenly. Why do you suppose he wanted us to promise we'd... Confusedly. You know what he said. Ruth, dully. His mind was wandering, I suppose. Andrew, with conviction. No. There was something back of it. Ruth. He wanted to make sure I'd be all right after he'd gone, I expect. Andrew. No, it wasn't that. He knows very well I'd naturally look after you without anything like that. Ruth. He might be thinking of something happened 5 years back, the time he came home from the trip. Andrew. What happened? What do you mean? Ruth. Dully. We had a fight. Andrew. A fight? What does that have to do with me? Ruth. It was about you, in a way. Andrew, amazed. About me? Ruth. Yes, mostly. You see, I'd found out I made a mistake about Rob soon after we were married, when it was too late. Andrew. Mistake? Slowly. You mean you found out you didn't love Rob? Ruth. Yes. Andrew. Good God. Ruth. And then I thought when Mary came it'd be different, and I'd love him. But it didn't happen that way. And I couldn't bear with his blundering and book reading, and I grew to hate him almost. Andrew. Ruth. Ruth. I couldn't help it. No woman could. It had to be because I loved someone else, I'd found out. She sighs wearily. It can't do no harm to tell you now, when it's all past and gone and dead. You were the one I really loved. Only I didn't come to the knowledge of it till too late. Andrew, stunned. Ruth, do you know what you're saying? Ruth. It was true, then. With sudden fierceness. How could I help it? No woman could. Andrew. Then you loved me that time I came home? Ruth, doggedly. I'd known your real reason for leaving home the first time. Everybody knew it. For 3 years, I've been thinking. Andrew. That I loved you? Ruth. Yes. Then that day on the hill you laughed about what a fool you'd been for loving me once, and I knew it was all over. Andrew. Good God, but I never thought... He stopped, shuddering at his remembrance. And did Rob... Ruth. That was what I'd started to tell. We'd had a fight just before you came, and I got crazy mad, and I told him all I've told you. Andrew. Gaping at her speechlessly for a moment. You told Rob you loved me? Ruth. Yes. Andrew, shrinking away from her in horror. You mad fool, you. How could you do such a thing? Ruth. I couldn't help it. I got to the end of bearing things without talking. Andrew. Then Rob must have known every moment I stayed here, and yet he never said or shook. God, how he must have suffered. Didn't you know how much he loved you? Ruth, dully. Yes, I knew he liked me. Andrew. Liked you? What kind of a woman are you? Couldn't you have kept silent? Did you have to torture him? No wonder he's dying, and you've lived here for 5 years with this between you? Ruth. We've lived in the same house. Andrew. Does he still think... Ruth. I don't know. We've never spoke a word about it since that day. Maybe from the way he went on, he supposes I care for you yet. Andrew. But you don't. It's outrageous. It's stupid. You don't love me. Ruth, slowly. I wouldn't know how to feel love even if I tried anymore. Andrew, brutally. And I don't love you, that's sure. He sinks into his chair, his head between his hands. It's damnable such a thing should be between Rob and me. Why, I love Rob better than anybody in the world and always did. There isn't a thing on God's green earth I wouldn't have done to keep trouble away from him. And I have to be the very one. It's damnable. How am I going to face him again? What can I say to him now? He groans with anguished rage. After a pause, he asked me to promise. What am I going to do? Ruth, you can promise, so it'll ease his mind and not mean anything. Andrew, what? Lie to him now when he's dying? Determinedly. No, it's you who will have to do the lying, since it must be done. You've got a chance now to undo some of all the suffering you brought on Rob. Go into him. Tell him you never loved me. It was all a mistake. Tell him you only said so because you were mad and didn't know what you were saying. Tell him something. Anything that'll bring him peace. Ruth, dully. He wouldn't believe me. Andrew, furiously. You've got to make him believe you, do you hear? You've got to. Now. Hurry. You never know when it may be too late. As she hesitates, imploringly. For God's sake, Ruth, don't you see you owe it to him? You'll never forgive yourself if you don't. Ruth, dully. I'll go. She gets wearily to her feet and walks slowly toward the bedroom. But it won't do any good. Andrew's eyes are fixed on her anxiously. She opens the door and steps inside the room. She remains standing there for a minute. Then she calls in a frightened voice. Rob? Where are you? Then she hurries back, trembling with fright. Andy, he's gone. Andrew, misunderstanding her, his face pale with dread. He's not... Ruth, interrupting him hysterically. He's gone. The bed's empty. The window's wide open. He must have crawled out into the yard. Andrew, springing to his feet. He rushes into the bedroom and returns immediately with an expression of alarmed amazement on his face. Come, he can't have gone far. Grabbing his hat, he takes Ruth's arm and shoves her toward the door. Come on, opening the door. Let's hope to God. The door closes behind them, cutting off his words as the curtain falls. Scene 2. Same as Act 1, Scene 1. A section of country highway. The sky to the east is already alight with bright color, and a thin, quivering line of flame is spreading slowly along the horizon rim of the dark hills. The roadside, however, is still steeped in the grayness of the dawn, shadowy and vague. The field in the foreground has a wild, uncultivated appearance as if it had been allowed to remain fallow in the preceding summer. Parts of the snake fence in the rear have been broken down. The apple tree is leafless and seems dead. Robert staggers weakly in from the left. He stumbles into the ditch and lies there for a moment, then crawls with a great effort to the top of the bank where he can see the sunrise, and collapses weakly. Ruth and Andrew come hurriedly along the road from the left. Andrew, stopping and looking about him. There he is. I knew it. I knew we'd find him here. Robert, trying to raise himself to a sitting position as they hasten to his side, with a wan smile. I thought I'd given you the slip. Andrew, with kindly bullying. Well, you didn't, you old scoundrel, and we're going to take you right back where you belong, in bed. He makes a motion to lift Robert. Robert. Don't, Andy. Don't, I tell you. Andrew, you're in pain? Robert, simply. No. I'm dying. He falls back weakly. Ruth sinks down beside him with a sob and pillows his head on her lap. Andrew stands looking down at him helplessly. Robert moves his head restlessly on Ruth's lap. I couldn't stand it back there, in the room. It seemed as if all my life I'd been cooped up in a room. So I thought I'd try to end as I might have, if I'd have the courage, alone, in a ditch by the open road watching the sunrise. Andrew. Rob, don't talk. You're wasting your strength. Rest a while, and then we'll carry you. Robert. Still hoping, Andy? Don't. I know. There is a pause during which he breathes heavily, straining his eyes toward the horizon. The sun comes so slowly. With an ironical smile, the doctor told me to go to the far-off places, and I'd be cured. He was right. That was always the cure for me. It's too late for this life, but he has a fit of coughing which racks his body. Andrew, with a hoarse sob, Rob, he clenches his fists in an impotent rage against fate. God, God. Ruth sobs brokenly and wipes Robert's lips with her handkerchief. Robert, in a voice which is suddenly ringing with the happiness of hope. You mustn't feel sorry for me. Don't you see I'm happy at last? Free, free, freed from the farm, free to wander on, eternally. He raises himself on his elbow, his face radiant, and points to the horizon. Look, isn't it beautiful beyond the hills? I can hear the old voices calling me to come, exultantly. And this time I'm going. It isn't the end. It's a free beginning, the start of my voyage. I've won to my trip, the right of release beyond the horizon. Oh, you ought to be glad. Glad for my sake. He collapses weakly. Andy. Andrew bends down to him. Remember Ruth. Andrew. I'll take care of her, I swear to you, Rob. Robert. Ruth has suffered. Remember, Andy. Only through sacrifice, the secret beyond there. He suddenly raises himself with his last remaining strength and points to the horizon where the edge of the sun's disk is rising from the rim of the hills. The sun. He remains with his eyes fixed on it for a moment. A rattling noise throbs from his throat. He mumbles, Remember, and falls back and is still. Ruth gives a cry of horror and springs to her feet, her hands over her eyes. Andrew bends on one knee beside the body, placing a hand over Robert's heart. Then he kisses his brother reverentially on the forehead and stands up. Andrew, facing Ruth, the body between them, in a dead voice. He's dead. With a sudden burst of fury, God damn you, you never told him. Ruth, piteously. He was so happy without my lying to him. Andrew, pointing to the body, trembling with the violence of his rage. This is your doing, you damn woman, you coward, you murderess. Ruth, sobbing. Don't, Andy. I couldn't help it, and he knew how I'd suffered too. He told you to remember. Andrew stares at her for a moment, his rage ebbing away, an expression of deep pity gradually coming over his face. Then he glances down at his brother and speaks brokenly in a compassionate voice. Forgive me, Ruth. For his sake, and I'll remember. Ruth lets her hands fall from her face and looks at him incomprehendingly. He lifts his eyes to hers and forces out falteringly. We both made a mess of things. We must try to help each other, and in time we'll come to know what's right. Desperately. And perhaps But Ruth, if she is aware of his words, gives no sign. She remains silent, gazing at him dully with a sad humility of exhaustion, her mind already sinking back into that spent calm beyond the further troubling of any hope. The curtain falls. Ooh, Beyond the Horizon by Eugene O'Neill. So, hmm. So, okay. As I'd always done and have reiterated many times on this channel, my interest in Eugene O'Neill's work started to be stoked again when I watched the PBS documentary American Masters, Eugene O'Neill, and I finally had to buy it from iTunes because I didn't pirate it or YouTube kept taking it down. But they mentioned this play in it as the one that his father came to see. His father, who more or less confessed on his deathbed that all his disappointments with having betrayed his talent and how he took the easy road and he mastered the play, The Count of Monte Cristo, and then he bought the play and made a fortune out of the play, but then became a slave to the play. All of this Eugene channels through James Tyrone in Long Day's Journey into Night. So everything I've just read these last 3 days is the play that James O'Neill's son, Eugene O'Neill, wrote. And James O'Neill sat in James O'Neill, one of the most prominent actors of I think the late 19th century, early 20th century, one in which Edwin Booth praised, who was one of the top actors at the time, John Wilkes Booth's brother. I wonder what it was like for James O'Neill to sit in that audience and watch his sons play. His son, kind of at the beginning of his playwriting career, more or less, he wrote a lot of one-act plays, but this is one of his first full-length, not features, full-length plays that he wrote and was performed and sold. I wonder how James felt. And in the documentary, they note that as the play ended, James was weeping. And so that much we know, but more than that, I really do wonder the amount of emotions he must have felt sitting there in that audience watching his sons play, and what he thought of it. I really do wonder. And I think it's making me think of, you know how sometimes people struggle to connect with other people, especially people that they love, people that are in their family or people that they're really close to, and like the everyday connections are one thing, like they're kind of a base level connection, but things that happen between yourself and another person, and things that happen on the family timeline that everybody knows happened, but everybody keeps quiet because nobody deals with it. There becomes kind of a fraying of like a bond between yourself and another family member, another loved one. I almost wonder if for James O'Neill seeing this play, seeing Eugene O'Neill's play, if that didn't strengthen a sort of connection. I wonder if I'm sure he felt proud of him because in the documentary, they talk about a lot of the things that were kind of failings of Eugene in relation to James. That he quit going to church. He was a lapsed Catholic, and how much of a disappointment that was. I think even James being born after the death of Edmund, how much he must have felt he was a disappointment as a replacement. And I almost wonder if that was Eugene's ambition to kind of overcome this blight of having existed in the place of his dead brother. Like his brother had to cease to exist for Eugene to exist. And I might be taking it far out there, but it's also the truth. Eugene O'Neill would not have existed if Edmund O'Neill had not died. And I've come across this in various, like, I watch a lot of stuff. I read a lot of stuff, I watch a lot of stuff, and you start to see the same recurring themes uh, in what people are talking about. And think I think for the emotion that James elicited on upon seeing beyond the horizon was in response to the fact that Eugene had created something. He did give life to it. He did give life to something. It was something that James could see with his own eyes before he died. His son gave life to something. He didn't take it away. And that's not fair to say Eugene took Edmund's life away. He didn't. Eugene is just the poor, kid that came after the dead kid. But I still think he felt the burden of being the dead kid's next kid and the heaviness of living in a house where a child had died, and because of another child of his older brother, Jamie, who either inadvertently or deliberately caused the death of Edmund, how much of that heaviness had seared into Eugene's soul. And I speak of that. I don't mean it literally, but I think even the most agnostic or atheistic person can admit to each person having a life force within them that's not wholly biological. And I think I have a lot of criticisms about Eugene. I think he was a terrible husband and a terrible father. And yes, I think a lot of that is due to his evolution and how he came to be, but it can't, I can acknowledge that, but I can't excuse it outright. But if we can begin to understand why that is, I think it kind of helps to make sense of the situation. And I think he himself was trying to understand all of this through all the plays he wrote. I was on pins and needles wanting to read the synopsis of this play or watch an adaptation, because that's where I come from and that's what I know, like reading the Cliff's Notes and watching the movie. But I'm really trying to not do myself a favor, but give myself the gift of actually reading the source material, reading the material, not source material, reading the genesis of it, and giving it its due. This play did not end like I thought it would. I knew from the documentary. They gave me the spoiler of two men being in love with the same woman, two brothers being in love with the same woman, and I but I didn't think this would necessarily be how it would end. I'm actually incredibly impressed. I was reading I don't know if it was the first or second act, but as I was reading it aloud, I could see what was going to happen, and even though it did happen, I was very impressed at the construction of it. And I'm even more impressed I didn't outright guess the ending of it. Like, more or less what's going to happen, but it doesn't end on a happy note. And this is kind of one of the first major plays that Eugene, full-length plays that he wrote. And that too is a recurrent theme, that a lot of his ending, especially on like The Iceman Cometh or Long Day's Journey into Night, those are not happy endings. I still haven't read Moon for the Misbegotten or Strange Interludes. I've read like somewhere into under 10 of the one act plays, but these are not happy endings, and they don't have to be happy endings, because I think a lot of the time in reality, the bulk of what we spend our time living, I think we fool ourselves into believing that we're hurtling towards something. And when we get to a place where we thought something would happen and it didn't, and it's so anticlimactic that it's like it's done, and then we're faced, if we made it, if you survive it, you're then faced with, well, then what? And then, like, the Peggy Lee, is that all there is? And it's a kind of like, it's a kind of reward and a kind of damnation. If you can get through all it took to get to that point, you've succeeded in a way, but you're also burdened with having to answer the unanswerable question: what do I do now? And I think that's something that Eugene was trying to find the answer for all of his life. The way that people dissect his life in that documentary is endlessly fascinating to me, and I don't think they were wholly wrong. And I think the reason why I feel so passionately about it is because it's one example that I feel up to enough to understanding why a person might be the way they are. It doesn't solve anything and everything. It doesn't absolve him of awful things he did. It helps explain it. But it's also terrifying to know that it doesn't, for most people, there is no absolvency. You can live your life and things can happen, and I don't think for everybody there's a clean, happy, healthy resolution. And you just have to live with those blighted marks on your timeline, and then you have to figure out how to deal with that. And it's said that his last words were, I knew it, born in a hotel room, and goddamn it, died in one. And so reading an ending like this, where I knew we were going to have to go back to those hills or back to a place where he could see the sun rise on the horizon, because where he was going, both figuratively and literally, was beyond the horizon. Um, God, how prophetic is that? Eugene didn't get to die in a ditch, which I don't know if somebody really wants to, but if they want to experience the seeing the last sunrise or sunset on their life, as it were, you wouldn't want to die in a fucking hotel room. But I guess that was what quote unquote fate had in store. I don't know if that's a kind of poetic justice. He was born in one and died in one. I think the ether is doing what it's doing, and we're just along for the ride. Tony Kushner said something really beautiful in that documentary that I either need to write down or I don't know, keep it somewhere. But maybe I could bring it up, and but I forget what the timestamp is. He's explaining how he's talking about how one person has to like make peace with the past in a way, and while they're dreading the future and trying to live in the present, and how it all like it's all this kind of maelstrom within a person that sometimes renders them immobile and unable to function. Because how are you supposed to move forward if you can't make peace with the past? How can you plan for a future that you don't know is going to happen? You can't. But you still have to deal with the fact that you're responsible for yourself, and at the end of the day, you reap what you sow. And if you haven't sown anything, if you haven't tended to yourself, you're gonna rot away, kind of like this Robert character did in this book. I don't know if Robert was doomed to fate. I think he kind of was. But yeah, he betrayed his heart. He wanted to go to sea, and some devil woman fell in love with him. But she was kind of ill-fated too. I don't know if it was her fate to hinder him, so she could be together with Andy. But there's always going to be some bitch fucking it up for the dudes. But what was I going to say? Notes on the text. I really like this book. Let's see. Emperor Jones. Anna Christie. I saw a little note thing, and then okay. Where is it? Okay, Beyond the Horizon. First produced by John D. Williams, February 3rd, 1920, at the Morosco Theater, New York City. Let's see. God, can you imagine being in an audience watching a play 100 years ago that you know fairly well now? How amazing would that be? All right, let me look up Beyond the Horizon. Play. Eugene O'Neill. When did James O'Neill die? Yeah, 1920. So, dude, he died August 10th, 1920, and this play debuted. What did I just say? I just said it. Beyond the Horizon premiered on Broadway at the Morosco Theater from February 3rd, 1920 to February 20th, 1920. So I had like a little over a 2-week run. And it transferred to the Criterion Theater from February 24th to March 5th, and finally transferred to the Little Theater from March 9th to June 26th. So somewhere in that time frame, I can't remember if we said he was there for the debut of it. James O'Neill saw the play relatively shortly before he died, because he had to go back to the home. He went to the homestead to die. Okay. Overview. The play takes place on a farm in the spring and then moves forward 3 years later in the summer and then finally 5 years later in late fall. The play focuses on the portrait of a family, and particularly only 2 brothers, Andrew and Robert. In the first act of the play, Robert is about to go off to sea with their Uncle Dick, a sea captain, while Andrew looks forward to marrying his sweetheart Ruth and working on the family farm as he starts a family. And then it all goes to shit. But you'll see that, or I'll see as I'm reading the plays, a lot of them are centered around family. I think he was always trying to deconstruct, reconstruct, construct his family through his work. And I think a lot of people are haunted by their families and the family tragedies and the family pain. These forces that are bigger than yourself, that you didn't ask for, in terms of things that happened, but you have to deal with because just because they're imbued in you. But if you don't, if you didn't experience it, if you didn't ask for it, and you're burdened with having to deal with it, then you have to spend the time figuring out how to deal with it. And for Eugene, that was writing the plays and filtering it and kind of like getting it out of him, sweating it out, like shedding it. But I don't think you can fully extract it. But he did as best he could. Sometimes I don't wonder why people's bibliographies are so prolific, because they're excavating their mind. So much of what they feel and what they think and what they've experienced and are trying to understand, desperately trying to understand it all. And on that level, I feel for him. According to the PBS American Experience program, theater historians point to O'Neill's Beyond the Horizon, which debuted in 1920 as the first Native American white man tragedy. The play emerged from O'Neill's association with the Provincetown Players, one of many so-called little theaters that developed in the 1910s to provide alternative fare to commercial drama at the time. So, very moving piece. It's interesting because I've also found in the plays that the big beats are big and happen very, very quickly, because they have to, because a play like this, I think it was like 80 pages. Let's see. 73. Yeah, it's like 80 pages. So not a lot of time to tell. I mean, kind of to tell the story, but So, anyways, I'm rambling. I thought this play was really good. I'm really glad I finally got to read the play that kind of moved James O'Neill. I I also think if you're gonna choose to be an art or choose to be an artist, or being an artist chooses you, moreover, I think it's really difficult to be so exposed to the people in your life because you're having to tell the truth, especially if you're exposing them in your expose. And there's just no way it's not going to hurt. You're doing the thing that you're actively not doing in real time. In real time, everybody's if you love somebody, you're being protective over them. In a sense, you're lying to them in the name of protection. But if you're expressing yourself through any kind of medium, if you're doing it to the best of your abilities and it's honest, it's gonna hurt. And writing a play about a family where there's a lot of like manipulation and I did this for you and now you're gonna go do your own thing, and you're indebted to the family because I worked so hard and this, that, and the other. It's very, very personal. And I guess I have a hard time understanding why the next generation should be saddled with any kind of price to pay because somebody else filled out the bill. And maybe that's the price you pay to enter into the thing, to enter into this life. And that's the price you have to accept, but do you have to accept it in the way that they're proposing it to you? No. But if you don't, will they shun you? Will they shut you out of the family? Maybe. Is that your problem? Necessarily, no. Does it still hurt? Yeah. So I'll just I don't know, I could ramble on forever because that's what I'm good at. I'll just say I wanted to read this for a long time because it was the play that James got to see of Eugene's. And I'm moved that he was moved by his son's play. I saw something very dear this morning. I watched Daniel Tosh post a video of him interviewing his son. Cute little video about a comedian interviewing his son in a very casual way, and he's very protective over him. But the things he does release, the things he does admit to, is so touching. And I almost cry. Like, I'm almost crying now. Like, he shared the fact that they had a little play wedding where his kid told him that he loved him. And at the end of the video, Daniel starts to get emotional. And Daniel Tosh is kind of known. He used to be kind of known more of like a frat boy comic, and like he's very sharp. He's very aggressive in his comedy. I think that's where a lot of his success comes from. He just cuts through it and just goes for the not for the jugular, but he just goes for the joke and doesn't hesitate. He just goes for it, and it's very aggressive. And sometimes that's a little off-putting, but in terms of like of being forthright and skilled as a comedian. I think it was an excellent way to execute it. At the end of his video, he talks very openly about his feelings for his son. And I think sometimes for some people, it's really parents. It's hard to express it, and I think not having been a parent, but I can see it in other people, and I'm speaking from a place I probably shouldn't be. Some people, the love a parent has for a child can be private and can be like sacred, and has personal meaning for the parent, and they keep it close to them. But seeing or hearing about James weeping at a play that he got to see, he got a play of his son's that he got to see right before he died, and being proud of him, I think that helped embolden Eugene to move forward with that trajectory, even though as he went on and kept excavating, it was incredibly painful. But it still had a strong tie to his dad that I don't think could be unbroken. The things that he thought might have been broken because of the family turmoil, this was one thing kind of sacred to Eugene that he ensured. He made this happen. He made this bond happen. It wasn't James that made something for his son and his son couldn't live up to. His son created something, not necessarily for his father, but in relation to what his father knows and could know and could understand and could bond over. I find it very moving. It's very moving. And didn't read this before. Glad to have read it now, and it's fun to have read it on this channel. And I don't mean these again. I don't need to ramble about it too much. It's not professional. I'm not an actor. I just read it out loud for more of my benefit more than anybody else's. But it's up here on my channel. Whoever wants to look at it. But I don't know. Just try to do the best. Not even kind of that, not that. Try to do the best you can. Try to do what you can with what you've got. And I feel for anybody that is trying it all to exist in a way that isn't painful, to try to find some happiness, even if it is dying in a ditch looking at a sunrise. Just trying to have some kind of peace. Yeah, and whether that's watching your sons play or talking about your son or writing a play about your feelings and your family, or whatever it is that you're actively engaging in and trying to find some semblance of peace. I think it's a beautiful thing. All right. I think that's about all I got to say. I'm not sure where to go from here. I'm not sure what or if the next thing I will be reading will be. Not the Count of Monte Cristo, but rest in peace to James O'Neill. What the fuck am I trying to say? I just thank you. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it or curious about it or enjoying my rambling. And I don't know. Thanks a lot. Until next time, if there is a next time, there probably will be a next time. I love you. Thanks.